We're studying the book of 1 Thessalonians, and we're in chapter 4. And I want to show you what these verses in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 are all about. Let's remember where we've been so far in this book. All the way back in chapter 1, Paul began writing to these Christians, and he began commending them. They had done a really good job of receiving the gospel. And so chapter 1 is all about these reasons for here's why I'm so excited about how you received the gospel. You set an example. Then when you come to chapter 2, what Paul does is he gives a defense for how he delivered the gospel. He didn't deliver the gospel with greed or deception, but instead he came caring for them with a genuine concern that they would know what is true. Then as you come to chapter 3, Paul talks about how he had so much concern for the Christians that he had left behind. Remember, he had been kind of run out of town, and he didn't know how the Christians were doing there. Were they like the seed that fell on the good soil in Jesus' parable, or were they like the seed that sprouted up but then were choked away? He didn't know, and so he sends Timothy to go back to Thessalonica to find out. In the last half of chapter 3, Timothy returns, and he says, now that Timothy has come to us from you and has brought us good news of your faith and love. And so he's talking about Timothy came and gives me this good report, and I'm overjoyed. And so that's where we've been so far in the book. Now in the last 2 chapters, Paul's going to transition. He's going to start talking about theology and doctrine and how to walk in a way that pleases God. That's what we turn to now in chapter 4. And verses 1 and 2 kind of introduce this new section. You see that here with the word finally. He says, finally then, brothers, we ask and urge you in the Lord Jesus. So he's going to talk about a new topic here. And what is that topic going to be? It's going to be this: how you ought to walk and to please God. So in the last couple sections here, Paul's going to talk about this idea, this new topic, how to walk and how to please God. And so in chapter 4, he's going to talk about sexual purity. Then he's going to talk about how to have brotherly love. And then he's going to talk about this theology question of what about Christians who die before Jesus returns. And so he's talking about doctrine and how you ought to walk and please God. Now, notice this, because this is so important. He's talking to Christians who are doing well, and he still urges them. He says, we ask and urge you in the Lord. So he's addressing Christians who are doing well, but he's still urging them to do more and more. Look at this. Finally then, brothers, we ask and urge you in the Lord Jesus, that as you received from us how you ought to walk and to please God, just as you are doing, that you do so more and more. So do you see this? Paul's not addressing a church that isn't really following God very well. He's addressing a church that's doing great. And he spent 3 chapters talking about that. But notice this, Christian, if you are walking in a way that pleases God, like if your life right now does please God, the thing that I think God would have you hear is don't take that as an excuse to ease up. Instead, the Christian who is already walking in a way that pleases God, they are to do so more and more. Another thing to notice here is that Paul is going to be referring to instructions he gave them while he was in Thessalonica. He says this in verse 2, for you know what instructions we gave you. So he's talking about things that he had already instructed them. You see that back in verse 1, that as you received from us. So some of these things are things he taught about when he was in Thessalonica, but they're so important. He's coming back to them. He comes back to this idea in verse 6, as we told you beforehand and solemnly warned you. So do you get the idea here? He's already talked about this when he was with them in Thessalonica, but this really matters even for a godly Christian. Notice also that what he said through the Lord Jesus. Perhaps the idea here is what the NASB translates, by the authority of the Lord Jesus. Paul isn't just making up arbitrary rules. Jesus has spoken about these things. And so Paul is relaying to them the truths that Jesus had given. Okay, this first section here in verses 3 through 8, this is going to be about sexual purity. And what Paul's going to do is he's going to give 6 reasons for why a Christian should pursue sexual purity. Let's go ahead and look at each one of these reasons. First reason is this. We see it in verse 3. Why should a Christian pursue sexual purity? The first reason is this. Because this is the will of God. This is the will of God for the Christian. That the Christian should live a life of sexual purity. You know, I don't know all of God's will for your life, but I do know this. God's will for you is that you would be sanctified in the realm of sexual purity. This word for sanctification, it's the Greek word behind it is the word hagiasmos. It looks like this. Hagiasmos. And it's actually used, that Greek word is used 3 times in these verses. It's translated as sanctification here in verse 3. But then in verse 4, it's translated as the word holiness. And then again in verse 7, it's translated as holiness. And so this idea of sanctification or living a holy life that's set apart to God occurs 3 times. So you really get the idea, okay, that's what this paragraph is all about. And this is God's will for you. I may not know a lot of what God's will is for your life, but I do know this. God's will for you is that you would be sanctified. Namely, that you would abstain from sexual immorality and that you would know how to control your own body in holiness and honor. I was speaking with a young man once, years ago, and he was living with his girlfriend, and he invited me to his apartment. And I came into his apartment. He wanted to know what is God's will for his life. And I turned to this verse, and I said, well, friend, God's will for you is that you would abstain from sexual immorality. Well, that's not what he wanted to hear. But that is God's will for the life of a Christian. And so, reason number 1, to pursue sexual purity, that's God's will for you. Reason number 2, we see it in verse 5. Christians are not to live in the passion of lust like the Gentiles who do not know God. You know, when you don't know God, you live by a different set of rules. You don't know what His heart is, what His desire is for you. You don't know what His will is for you, or you don't respect it. The Gentiles in Thessalonica, the people who just were pagan and had no respect for Yahweh, they really were living uncontrolled lives. Sexual immorality was polluting Thessalonica. The entire society was rife with sexual immorality. It was part of their religion. Generally, the society looked down on adultery, but basically, if you're a young man, you can basically indulge in any other form of sexual impurity. One Greek politician, Demosthenes, said this: "Mistresses we keep for the sake of pleasure, concubines for the daily care of our persons, but wives to bear us legitimate children and to be faithful guardians of our households." And that's the world that these Christians were living in. And Paul is saying, look, the Gentiles, they don't know God. And so they don't control their own bodies. Instead, their passions, their lusts control them. And you're a Christian. You're not to live like that. The third reason we see here in verse 6, first part of verse 6, is this: sexual sin hurts other people. That's why you should pursue sexual purity, because sexual sin hurts other people. that no one transgress and wrong his brother. Sexual sin is a sin against somebody else. You think specifically of adultery here. Even our culture talks about this as cheating on someone. There's a sense of you're hurting somebody else through sexual sin. And so that's one more reason Paul gives for why to pursue sexual purity, because there's no such thing as a private sexual sin. Sexual sin hurts other people. The next reason for why Christians should be sexually pure is here in the last part of verse 6. Reason number 4, God judges sexual immorality. This is something that Christians should not take lightly. Paul says this, because the Lord is an avenger in all these things. When it comes to sexual immorality, the Lord is an avenger. He takes revenge. He is a God of justice. And Christians need to be solemnly warned about this. I heard a stat that said something like 42% of practicing Christians these days believe that it's actually wise to live with your boyfriend or girlfriend before you get married. Now, I might argue, how many of those people truly are believers if you're thinking this way? But there's a lot of people who name the name of Christ who think, it's fine. I can live with my boyfriend or girlfriend or live in a homosexual lifestyle or any number of sexual sins and be fine with God. I guess when I read this, I think we need to be warned. We need to be solemnly warned that God is a God who doesn't just turn a blind eye towards sexual sin. He actually judges. Next reason for why a Christian should pursue sexual purity here in verse 7, for God has not called us for impurity, but in holiness. Again, that idea of being sanctified, living a holy life apart to God. This idea of being called. For the sports fans, I think of the NFL draft. And you have the young man sitting in his home surrounded by family and friends, and he's waiting for the call. Is the NFL team going to call me so that I could be drafted? And finally the phone rings and he's been called up. Well, he's not been called up to mess around and just play. He's meant to win games, right? If you're a Christian because God picked you. God called you. And he didn't call you just so that you would go on to live a life of impurity, but that you would be set apart for him to live a life of holiness. God's called you for better things. One more reason Paul gives for why a Christian should pursue sexual purity is this. Therefore, whoever disregards this, disregards not man, but God. Someone who disregards the reasons we've seen so far for sexual purity. If someone reads this text and goes, that's just old-fashioned, that's kind of out of date, I don't need that anymore. You need to hear this. You're not disregarding some rules that some church made up. You're not disregarding man, you're disregarding God himself. And that's a serious thing. And so there's people who say, I can be right with God and enjoy my sexual sin. It's not the case. You can't be right with God and reject him at the same time. You're going to have to pick. And God has something better for us. Living a life of holiness. Living a life that is under control, holiness and honor. A life that is sanctified. This is what God has for you. This is what God has in mind for you when he called you. And it's a good design for your life. And so that's what Paul writes to these Christians living in a pagan culture. He reminds them, as Christians, you're doing great, but you need to press on. You need to walk in a way that honors God more and more. All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you again next time.